One is SWWT. I'm going to end up saying like 4 W's at least 5 times. Just wait.
Right.
That's the only thing I'm worried about, especially since
Her
no,
second.
camera.
Yeah, the historians.
Okay, great.
I don't want us to
Sure.
slide on any time. All right, good morning, everyone. I'm really excited to introduce our panel and our panelists to you today. Our topic for today is challenges and alliances across boundaries of race, sexuality, and class. So I'm going to introduce the panelists in the order that they're speaking, and they'll come up and do their presentation. And we'll look forward to vigorous Q&A afterwards. So our first presenter is Andrew Pope. He's a third-year graduate student in the history department at Harvard University. He graduated as a double major in history and African American studies from the University of Rochester. His current research is focused on the intersections of Black power, welfare rights, radical feminist, and gay liberation movements in the South after 1965. He previously worked as a housing and tenants' rights organizer in Rochester, New York. The title of his paper is Our Incompleted Heritage, Southern Radical Feminism in New Orleans, 1968 to 1985. Then we'll hear from Patricia Ulbrich, who's a visiting scholar in women's studies at the University of Pittsburgh. For more than 3 decades, Dr. Ulbrich's research has focused on women's studies and women's issues, including how individuals, race, class, and gender shape their life chances, history of the women's movement, and its impact as a catalyst for change. Since coming to Pittsburgh, she's co-founded the Women's and Girls Foundation of Southwest Pennsylvania and is director of In Sisterhood, the women's movement in Pittsburgh. The topic of her paper, Bridge Builders, Black Women in Pittsburgh's Women's Movement. Then we'll hear from Christopher Ramsey. He's a doctoral candidate at Loyola University in Chicago. His primary research interest is post-war urban history in the United States with an emphasis on race, ethnicity, and gender. His dissertation, Forgetting How to Hate, the Evolution of White Responses to Integration in Chicago, 1945 to 1987, explores how the influence of the civil rights movement and this feminist movement on white neighborhood organizations really challenged the long-standing practice of utilizing racial violence as a way to enforce residential segregation in the city's South Side. His topic is Southwest Women Working Together, Liberation, Integration, and Leadership on the Southwest Side of Chicago, 1968 to 1978. And last, we'll hear from Chelsea Del Rio. She's a PhD candidate in the Department of History at the University of Michigan. She studies the intersection of lesbian and feminist politics and identity in post-war America. This research is informed and fostered by over 15 years of engaged feminist activism, during which time Chelsea coordinated grassroots projects such as Clinical Defense and guided statewide feminist efforts through her service as Vice President and then President of California's National Organization for Women. Currently, Chelsea coordinates the Bridge Project, which facilitates relationships between feminists of different ages to encourage intergenerational dialogue. The topic of her paper will be looking to lesbian feminism, opening historical narratives, and fostering activist alliances. This sounds like it's going to be a fantastic panel. I'm really excited to be helping us to keep time and to coordinate our discussion afterwards. I'm Robyn Spencer. I'm an assistant professor of history at Lehman College in the Bronx. I'm really excited. I think it's going to be a great panel. I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker. Thank you.
At a podium talking for the first time, I think ever, so I'm a bit nervous, but I'll try to do it. So thank you everybody for coming today. This is actually a great turnout. I enjoyed yesterday's panels tremendously, and I'm excited for another good day today.
A little louder, please.
Okay, and I'd like to thank Professor Spencer for chairing this panel. So when I began this project and submitted the abstract, I was a second-year graduate student, and I completed a research paper on Southern radical feminism, and I thought I was going to expand it into a dissertation on Southern radical feminism. 1 year later, and a just completed dissertation prospectus, instead of New Orleans, I now write about Georgia. Instead of an exclusive focus on radical feminism, I now also include an analysis of the gay liberation movement and Black power. So this paper today is just on New Orleans and just on radical feminism, but in the question and answer period, I'm happy to talk about how I started from there and ended up in Georgia. So today I would like to do three things. First, lay out my overall argument about Southern radical feminism in New Orleans. Second, I will highlight the significant role feminists played in toppling the Southern Student Organizing Committee, the largest Southern leftist student movement organization. This is an important moment in feminist history because it is a moment of connection between feminist activists in the North and the South.
which of these is more significant, the presence of the charismatic individual or the cell structure?
Thank you. Just a quick reminder, just for the recording purposes, to try to repeat back at least the salient parts of the question.
Oh, sure, sure. The question was, what's more important, a charismatic bridge builder or a structure? And I have to say, it depended on the timing. I think Miss Fox came into now in late 1968. There wasn't much going on there. She became an important figure because she had lots of relationships and was highly respected in the community. And so she could make those linkages for them. They created the multi-chapter structure in late 1973, 1974. And so the now was already fairly well established. The woman who founded Now in Pittsburgh was president of National Now. There were several Now members on the national board. So they were pretty confident by that point. And it was once they were a little confident in building those multiple chapters that you began to get a critique of, we really need to rethink how we're approaching racism. And one of the things I didn't say was, because this really started in like 1977, was black women started saying, you white women need to understand you're racist. It's not, okay, white women, let's let the black women in. It's, you need to understand you're racist and where that racist is located. And you need to understand us. And so I think consciousness raising in those small groups then opened that up as a possibility. So I would say it's not either or. I would say it's a process.
The second person.
Thank you. The Pittsburgh presentation is fascinating, and it so contradicts so much we've been hearing about now in the plenaries. I loved it. I loved all of your papers. They were wonderful.
Thank
Great
you.
new material. I just had a real quick comment for Andrew, which is, I would really hope you would change your title, because you talked about women's liberation, and there's such a reduction of women's liberation to radical feminism, which we have all the confusion because we use the word radical to mean left wing or going through the roots or whatever different usages we have that we're using at the time. But the term radical feminism, I think, is being expanded to cover the entire women's liberation movement, and it doesn't. So that's my one comment, because in your paper you did talk about women's liberation, but in your title and in some of a few references you used the term radical feminism to cover everything.
Yep. So the comment is on my use of the term radical feminism, and the idea that there is a tendency to expand the term radical feminism to include everything in women's liberation. And I agree with you, and that's something Chelsea and I actually were talking about yesterday, and it's something since I submitted the paper, a year ago, I've moved on from, but I understand, and it's still, trying to think through the differences within women's liberation, like still maintain an understanding of difference within women's liberation while understanding that radical feminism doesn't stand in for all of women's liberation. So I agree.
My question/comment is also for Andrew. So more of a comment, but a bit of a question. As you sort of move from New Orleans to, are you doing Atlanta or somewhere else?
I'm doing Georgia. So
okay,
like
Georgia, we're doing rural.
Yeah, so Atlanta, but also kind of rural, looking at the differences between rural and Georgia.
Okay, so just to sort of keep your eye out for connections and not think that you're not doing New Orleans anymore. I say this because one of the cities that I researched was Durham, North Carolina,
Yeah.
Where the YWCA has an amazing women's center and is the sort of heart of the whole thing. And they had, in the archive still, they had cataloged all of the newspapers that the library at the Women's Center at the YWCA had, and one of them was a newspaper called Distaff, which was New Orleans African American feminist newspaper in Durham. And so I think just sort of, keep your eye open as you're going for those sort of broader Southern connections.
Yeah.
This is also a plug to come to Joey and I's panel on Southern stuff later this afternoon.
I am.
But just when you were talking about that, I was like, this New Orleans newspaper shows up in the middle of North Carolina, so I think there's a broader sort of Southern feminist movement to just keep your eyes open for.
So the comment is a question about, or a comment about the interconnectedness of the Southern feminist movement, and that's the tough part about trying to figure out scale of, of a dissertation project, which is, city, state, region. I ended up with a state. But you're right that I started in New Orleans and then I moved to Georgia because of the connections. The Southern Student Organizing Committee was based out of Georgia, even though it provoked activism in New Orleans, and there are a lot of connections there.
Was there a fourth person I identified? Yes.
My question's for Christopher, and I was really fascinated by your work on Southwest Women Organizing Together. I think it's a tremendously important group. In terms of your sources, what kinds of sources did you find available? Did you do oral history interviews with some of the leaders, and what's available for studying this organization?
Okay, that's a great question. The question is about sources. And, well, I'm going to do some oral histories. I'm in the middle of my dissertation, and we were actually talking about the fun event that's the IRB. And that's basically, yeah, I think a lot of people understand what that's like. So I've actually just gotten IRB approval to talk to some of these activists.
Sorry, not all of us know what it is. What is the
Oh,
IRB?
sorry, Institutional Review Board. And at least, if you're working at the university, especially if you're writing a dissertation, everything is obviously going to be going through the administration. They're going to check everything you do. And because there's always a concern about any sort of research involving human subjects, even if you're just putting a recorder in front of them and saying, let's just talk about your life and your past, they want to make sure that you're on the up and up, so to speak. And at least the IRB, at where I'm at, Loyola Chicago, it's all staffed by people who are in biology and medical sciences, so they take everything very, very strict and serious. So I basically had 5 revisions of it over 4 months before it got approved. And oftentimes it'd just be 2 or 3 sentences, and they'd argue about a word. But it's done, so I can start doing that. So yes, I do hope to do some oral interviews. Unfortunately, many of the women I referenced in this paper have passed away over time. They were in their 40s and 50s when they got involved and they just got started. So I won't be able to talk to them. I'm hoping I can find Judith Yeager. I believe she's still alive. I just don't know where she is. So I'm trying to track her down because I'd love to talk to her. As for the sources I do have, well, it's a mix between traditional newspaper sources like the Chicago Tribune, also local newspapers. Southwest Women Working Together had its own newsletter, which is oddly enough at Northwestern, which is in the northern suburbs of Chicago, which surprised me. But apparently, when women's programs were being created in the 70s, they actually were paying attention to these different groups, and so they would subscribe to the newsletters. And so it's the best source they have from these women directly. The YWCA has metropolitan records at University of Illinois Chicago, although those are very incomplete. Basically, after 1963, it's basically very, very spotty, which is frustrating because the YWCA itself is going through some very fascinating changes. In Chicago, for instance, it called itself the largest women's liberation organization in the city. And they said we had 200,000 members, which every Y member was a member. But then there's a lot of debate among Y members whether or not they want to call themselves that, but that's a different topic, I suppose. So those are the main sources for this particular paper.
Thank you.
Can we take a second set of hands? I saw a few people, so 1, 2, anyone else? 3. Okay.
Thank you all for your presentation. I'm not an academic. Actually, I'm an activist, and I do work in the community. And I'm always interested in how history is relevant to the struggles we have now. And so if I asked each of you to say just a little bit about the relevance of your presentation to current ongoing struggles that we have in communities around issues of work and wages and gentrification in a lot of our neighborhoods and ongoing assaults on women's reproductive rights and lots of racist policies around healthcare and violence still in our neighborhoods. If you could make some connection of your topic to ongoing struggles, that would be interesting for me to hear. Thank you.
Sure. I'll be happy to start that. And this is the relevance of our discussions today for contemporary activism. I would say that one of the things that's important, well, in working with diverse groups, let me say that. It doesn't have to be a coalition, but working in diverse groups. I think one of the things that's extremely important is for white people to listen to people of color. And not to assume that they understand what their experiences are, but to be informed by them. And I think the reproductive justice movement nationally right now is kind of at the forefront of that in really challenging white feminists not to impose their view of reproductive justice on all women, but to listen to women of color and to understand what their needs are and what their perspectives are. And so I think what happened in Pittsburgh and I think elsewhere was using consciousness raising and really using that technique as a way to force people to listen to other people and to understand. And so I think that continues to be important.
Thank you for that question. As an activist and academic, I'm always thinking about what that relationship is. And the research is grounded in my past as an activist. And my hope is that the work that I do is in some way beneficial to the communities that I write about. Lesbian history is woefully underrepresented in history generally. And so part of the project that I'm doing is creating a history that allows lesbians in the queer community to see the work that has been done in the past. And I think one thing that can be taken away from that is just learning with and connecting with all of the ideas that have been proposed in queer rights activism, including the radical ones, perhaps especially the radical ones when we exist in a time where marriage equality is so much the focus, which is a really important concrete right that can improve people's lives, but that there are a lot of other areas where our activism could really be used to improve queer lives, including job protections, day-to-day safety, all of these things. And there are ways in which the women that I study addressed, those very real issues of safety, of being able to support yourself without being married to a man, those sorts of realities.
I think for me, the biggest takeaway for today would be to not see direct services as existing in some sort of binary with radicalism or revolutionary ideology. The idea that direct services can be a radicalizing event, that people need food, healthcare, housing in order to live, in order to be, to have activism, to live their lives, and so to not see them as in a binary. And I think that's something that comes through very well in most places, but in particular the South, given the particular economic and social conditions under Jim Crow of the African Americans were living within in New Orleans.
Chicago's got a very, very shameful history, and I think even today it's still very shameful. And when it comes to matters like racial segregation, economic inequality, and if I had more time and could talk about like how this project fits into my dissertation as a whole, I would sort of discuss about how this group pushes back against some of the very negative aspects of demographic change, so to speak, like the violence I mentioned earlier in the paper, but also how there was limits to what they could do. I mean, most residents don't join the SWWT, most don't join the YWCA, and the Southwest Side struggles, and it still struggles to the present day with a lot of issues of race and class. But I think that nonetheless, there's still merit in sort of evaluating groups like this that show that you can stand up for yourself without trampling on the rights of others. Because in a place like Chicago, that's actually a really innovative concept. It's such a provincial town where, well, it is, where people think, well, if I'm going to protect my interests, it usually means that to get what I want, it has to come at the expense of somebody else. And I think groups like this were willing to show that it didn't have to be a zero-sum game all the time, that you could reach out to different groups, different constituencies, and you could actually try. And in Chicago, we're still trying, and we're probably going to be trying for a very, very long time. But yeah, I guess at least this is the thing about the place I live in. I guess I have to give that sort of more ambiguous answer. But I think there's still value in sort of this trying to keep in mind what the SEC can embody and the potential that it has, and that potential still exists today, even if the group itself does not.
Wonderful. we're running out of time. I'm just gonna ask the two last people maybe just to articulate their questions and then maybe they can just answer. So there were two last
Thank you.
two numbers I gave out there. Two other questions that were out there. Was it you? And maybe you guys think so. Yes.
Okay, I was very interested in how the Pittsburgh women's movement in now began to request additional chapters as opposed to creating a large chapter, because I think that opened up so many spaces for people who might have been a little shy about entering a large organization that may just de facto end up in a hierarchical structure of some kind, or possibly white controlled structure. It allowed more room to have black leadership and also to have people really communicating with each other, as you described. And I was wondering whether that led to other similar movements in other cities.
Oh, okay, sure.
Familiar with that?
Sure.
But before answering, sorry, we're just gonna get both questions out
No,
there
I'm
and then.
just-
Like,
Oh, okay.
Okay, perfect.
Talk to him after.
Okay, perfect. Thank
Okay.
you. That'll be the last
Okay,
one.
the question was, how Pittsburgh Now negotiated having multiple chapters and what the impact of that was in terms of creating spaces, and then did that, was that a model for other cities? The origin of that came in, Pittsburgh was the first state to have a state chapter. When Pennsylvania passed the ERA in 1972, I believe. And the Now members working on that from Pittsburgh, and Ellie Smeal was one of them, said, you know, if we're going to pass legislation, if we're going to deal with laws, we have to focus on the states. And the national Now structure was regional. And she said, this is totally unrealistic. And so the first thing they did was petition National Now to allow them to have a state chapter. So once they had a state chapter, then they were organizing around the state. And Ellie was the first president. She lived in the South Side, and the meetings were always held in Pittsburgh. If you don't know the typology of Pittsburgh, it's divided by rivers. It's very hilly. It's and it's very provincial. It's extremely provincial. So there were two issues. One was Ellie and other suburban women didn't want to be driving into Pittsburgh for meetings. They wanted to have meetings in their own neighborhoods. Two, there were limited resources, and there were some informal leaders who wanted money to go to the National Now conferences, but because they weren't now in formal leadership positions, they weren't entitled to have money. So the idea was, let's have a chapter in every neighborhood, really relate to people who have common interest, provide leadership opportunities to elevate people, and then each chapter will have resources and everybody can go to the conferences. So, okay, then your question also was,
I'm
sorry,
Pat.
Okay.
The other panel is literally like in the hall.
Okay.
Lined
We'll
up.
talk later.
Maybe you can have more.
Yes,
Yeah.
absolutely,
Thank
absolutely.
You so much.
Oh,